Hi friends, I'm Sarah. Welcome back to my channel, Sunset Bow Tarot. So today I wanted to do kind of a fun VR. This is to a tag that was started by Marlene and Theresa, which is tarot to the extreme. So the idea here is that she came up with several different categories of sort of polar opposite concepts. And the idea is that you look in your tarot collection to see what decks you might have that would best fit these polar opposite concepts. So it's a really fun idea because it really gives you a chance to take a look at what in your collection might be super different from other items in your collection. So hope you'll hang out with me while we take a look at some of my extreme decks. All right, so the first category is Minimalist versus Maximalist. And for my Minimalist deck, I picked kind of a fun one. This one's relatively new to my collection. It was a Kickstarter that just came in earlier this year, and I haven't used it all that much yet, only for a couple of readings. But this is the Location Tarot, the Spirit of Place, and I really love the concept of this deck. So this is a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but as you can see, it's just the location. The figure itself is in the card, but in the form of spot gloss or UV gloss. So I don't know, it might be kind of hard to see. I'm going to do my best to see if I can catch it on camera, but let me see if I can find a good one. So, you know, this is the Ace of Cups, for example, and it's just the surroundings of the normal Ace of Cups with spot gloss. The hand and the cup and everything else is depicted in UV spot gloss. So again, I don't know if this is showing up on camera, but here's the Lover's card. Here's the Ten of Swords. So again, a Rider-Waite-Smith, but even pared down further beyond a normal Rider-Waite-Smith, down to just showing the surroundings of the characters, and the actual characters themselves are only visible if you hold the card at the exact right angle. So super minimalist. So that's again the Location Tarot. This is a deck by Destiny, and it was like I said, it was a Kickstarter, and I just think it's a really cool concept. I love decks that have a really strong sense of place. So this was kind of a cool one that felt very much up my alley. It kind of gives you that opportunity to imagine that you're in the location of the card. A good deck for almost, you know, path working type of work. So a really cool deck. Anyway, that is the Location Tarot, my Minimalist deck. For my Maximalist deck, I picked the Playful Heart Tarot. I love this deck so much. You can see that color-wise and illustration-wise, this deck has absolutely everything going on. It has all kinds of stuff happening in the card. It has all kinds of bright colors, cute characters. There's so many little details, but that's what makes this deck really fun to read with, is that all of the little details tell you something. This is actually a really, really, really smart deck. I think it's just wonderfully done, and it's one of those decks that I feel like people might think that this looks kind of simple or even almost, you know, childlike in its imagery, which it is, but it's very deep. There's so much going on in all of these cards, and even though they're so cute, and it's a really, really wonderful deck to read with. So this is the one I picked as my Maximalist deck. Again, this is the Playful Heart Tarot. So the next category is daytime versus nighttime, and for this I picked a pair of decks that are by the same creator and very similar in terms of their form factor and some of the art styles, and yet could not be more night and day in terms of personality. So this is the Victorian Romantic Tarot and the Bohemian Gothic Tarot, both by Baba Studio. And for some reason, these decks to me always kind of feel like sisters, except like one is goth and one is prep. I don't know. That's what they always feel like to me. So we'll start with the one that I picked for daytime. This is the Victorian Romantic Tarot. A lot of folks have probably seen this one already. It's been around for a while. They did just come out with a new edition of it recently, but mine is the 3rd edition. And again, this deck I don't know, it does feel like mostly a daylight deck in comparison to, you know, the Bohemian Gothic, for example. It has all this beautiful Victorian artwork. The colors are really bright and beautiful, and it's just a really gorgeous deck. You know, this is a fun one to read with. I actually haven't read with it in a while, and I really need to get it out again and mess around with this one again. But as we compare this deck to the Bohemian Gothic, you will see why I sort of think of these decks as siblings, but one is goth and one is prep. The Bohemian Gothic obviously has just a darker tone to it overall, visually speaking. You know, most of the cards do take place at what seems like night. Obviously, this deck has sort of a kind of old-timey or camp, like Victorian horror almost kind of feel to it. I love this deck. It's really, really fun to read with around Halloween time, and I thoroughly enjoy it at that time of year. But this is definitely a nighttime deck in comparison to the Victorian Romantics. So, you know, two gorgeous decks with a fair number of sort of similarities in their overall kind of artwork feel, but definitely night and day in terms of personality. All right, next up we have Best Shuffle versus Worst Shuffle. So for Best Shuffle, I selected the Pagan Otherworlds, which is a deck I absolutely love and I keep in this very special box. This deck, the shuffle on this is just so beautiful. This is, I think, the second edition of the Pagan Otherworlds, and it's on this just very high quality, like air cushion playing cardstock, and it just shuffles like a dream. It's just the most perfect, like if you're the kind of person who loves shuffling playing cards, which I am, this deck shuffles, well, when they're not spraying all over the place, this deck shuffles just gorgeously. It's a really, really wonderful deck to work with. So again, I should probably actually show some of the cards, shouldn't I? This is the Pagan Otherworlds. This is by Usi, an absolutely gorgeous deck. I love this one. I don't think I could ever not have this in my collection. It's, you know, definitely a pippish deck, but meant to be read in sort of a Rider-Waite-Smith way. There are hints in all of the pips to the Rider-Waite-Smith meanings of the cards, even though the pips are sort of more front and center. And yeah, it's just, it's such a beautiful deck with a totally unique feel to it, and I just absolutely adore it. Worst shuffle absolutely won't be a surprise to anyone. The worst shuffling deck in my collection is absolutely the Texture Tarot. This is one of those decks where, thank goodness I love the imagery so much, because if this deck wasn't an absolute #1 top, like, workhorse reader for me, I don't know if I could put up with the shuffle, but because it is that kind of deck for me, I do put up with the shuffle. I use this deck a lot to read for other people. It's incredibly talkative, and somehow it just really gives clear messages in just about every situation, and I really love it, and I love working with it as in terms of reading it, but it sucks to shuffle. Like, it can only be shuffled overhand. The cards are basically like cardboard. It's like they're made out of a cereal box, and they're very brittle, and they get creases in them very easily, and if you try to riffle shuffle it, you're probably going to get creases in it. And yeah, the creator of this deck uses this cardstock, I believe, for environmental reasons, which is absolutely laudable, you know, for sure. But honestly, it's a terrible shuffle. But like I said, I love to read with this deck, and it's just one of those ones that is a true workhorse. It's always reliable. It always comes through for me in any situation. You know, if I'm going to read for other people, this deck is one of the ones that I grab like 90% of the time. And it just honestly is such a great reader that I put up with how much I dislike shuffling it. The next category is Confronting versus Comforting. And for my Confronting deck, I chose the Deviant Moon. This is a deck that I never thought that I would be into. But I had so many people say that they had such a great experience reading with it, that I eventually succumbed and I got it, and I did also have a great experience reading with it. But the thing about this deck, a lot of people say that this deck is really great for shadow work, and the reason is not just that the artwork is dark feeling. The reason is that this deck really pinpoints the shadow meaning of each card. It really focuses in on that, you know, really dark side of the interpretation of each card. And as I'm going through here, you can kind of see, you know, how that is. So it definitely is confronting in a way that is healthy. It forces you to think about things not in always the most happy, positive light, but to take a look at what the dark side of a situation might be, or what aspects of it you're avoiding, or, you know, what aspects of it are, you know, kind of simmering under the surface. And so it's really, like I said, really wonderful for shadow work in that way. And again, not just because the imagery can be kind of creepy at times, but because of the way each of the cards is interpreted. On the comforting side here, we've got literally like the most soft, soothing, comforting possible deck out there in the world, I feel like. This is the Guardian Angel Tarot. This used to be by Doreen Virtue and Radley Valentine, but it just has Radley Valentine's name on the box in its most recent printings. This is out of print right now, but I have the Radley Valentine edition. And this deck is just, it's like Victorian angels and like different little Victorian illustrations on this artwork. It's even got like a full write-up of like how to interpret the card. I mean, you don't need to think even to use this deck. This is one of those decks that just fully gives you the comforting, uplifting message that you need. And so this is one of those decks that I only reach for when I truly need a hug. This deck also, there's a thing in my family, I've talked about this before, but there's a thing in my family where my mom's grandmother, so my great grandmother, Grandma Nettie, is someone that my family always thinks of as being my mom's guardian angel, or sort of the family's guardian angel. And just the aesthetic of this deck, you know, and the fact that it's called the Guardian Angel Tarot really sort of very much fits with that whole concept of a guardian angel who's a great grandmother. So it just, I don't know, this one really works to sort of evoke that energy for me. And again, it just fully feels like a hug and nothing else. I mean, it's just pure comfort food, this deck. All right, the next set of categories is every day versus every so often. And I specifically picked 2 decks by the same creator for this one because I have very different relationships with the 2 of them in a way that I thought was maybe kind of interesting. I don't know. Anyway, so these are both of Cat Black's decks, the Touchstone Tarot and the Golden Tarot. And the one I picked for every day was the Touchstone Tarot. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that this is absolutely one of my soul decks. It's a deck that I absolutely adore, and it's a deck that I go to when I really need to have my butt kicked in a kind way. And this deck just feels really personal. It's like you can see all these people in the deck are looking right at you, and because of that, it feels like they know you. This deck feels very much like going out for a cup of coffee with a friend who is just like staring into your soul and knows you so well that you're not going to get away with anything. And they're, you know, that kind of friend who's going to actually call you out, like a true friend. And so I really adore this deck because of that. It has just a very personal feel to me. And because of that, I reach for this one really frequently. When I really am doing kind of a very personal reading, this deck always really fits the bill for that. And so again, this one feels more every day than the Golden Tarot. The reason why this one is more of an every so often deck as opposed to an everyday deck is because while my relationship with the Touchstone Tarot is like hyper personal, my relationship with this deck is weirdly impersonal, but not in a bad way. This deck, and I don't know why it is, but this is the way it's always felt to me. It feels impersonal in that it almost feels like when I do a reading with this deck, it's not really about me. It's about like the whole world. I don't know why that is, but this deck feels like it just has this really broad perspective. You know, this deck is about it feels kind of political almost in a way. It feels like it's about what's going on in the broader world as opposed to just what's going on with me. And because of that, I don't reach for it as much because, you know, for me, tarot is more of a personal psychological practice in a lot of ways when I read tarot for myself. And so the Touchstone is the deck that I tend to reach for that type of work more often. But this one, when I do feel like I want that wider perspective, this is one that I reach for. And I wish I could explain why they feel so different in that way. And it might just be because this deck, because it's a medieval world, it feels like it just depicts a society, you know? There are so many ways in which this deck really feels like it depicts just kind of a broader vision of what the world is and what the world was like at a particular period of time, and you know, really gets at some of those details of what people's lives were like in a way. Whereas again, the Touchstone feels like these people are just like looking into my soul and they know me, and they're gonna tell me things about me and my life and what's going on in my own head. So yeah, I don't know why, but because of that, I reach for the Touchstone a lot more often than I reach for the Golden Tarot, even though, you know, they're both wonderful decks. They're by the same creator. They're the same sort of general art style in terms of, you know, they're both digital collage of classic artworks. The Golden Tarot focuses more on medieval artwork, whereas the Touchstone Tarot focuses more on Baroque and Renaissance artwork. And maybe it makes sense because, you know, at the time that the artwork of the Touchstone was being created, art, I think, and I'm not an art historian by any means, but I think art was more individualistic at this point in time than it was in the medieval era. But yeah, this one feels much more individual. This one feels much more sort of broad and universal and societal. So the next set of categories in this tag is overrated versus underrated. And I kind of wanted to talk about this in a little bit of a different way. I don't necessarily like calling decks overrated per se, because I don't want to always like imply that people who like that deck shouldn't like it, or like the deck maybe doesn't deserve the love it gets, because people like what they like, obviously, and I think that you know, that's totally great. I think I wanted to take this more in the direction of maybe like thinking about themed decks, and thinking about themed decks in terms of decks that don't really bring something new or particularly interesting, I guess, to our understanding of tarot, as compared to themed decks that use their theme to do something new potentially and do something interesting with card meanings. So the decks that I picked for this are the Crystal Unicorn Tarot and the Game of Thrones Tarot. So let's start with the Crystal Unicorn Tarot. So this is the one I would put in, I guess, the overrated category, but I don't actually think it's overrated or anything like that. I love this deck. I love working with it. It makes me really happy. It speaks to my inner child in a really delightful way, and it's beautiful, and I really, really love it. The thing that I will say about this deck is that fundamentally, all this deck is a Rider-Waite-Smith clone with unicorns in place of people. Like, that's really all it is. There is nothing really new or interesting that the theme brings to the tarot. Like, this is exactly what it says on the packaging. It is a unicorn tarot deck, and all of the unicorns are just in your normal Rider-Waite-Smith settings and situations, and there's nothing really different about reading with this than reading with a normal Rider-Waite-Smith deck, you know, a classic Rider-Waite-Smith deck. You know, there's a little addition in terms of like the majors have different crystals in them. So like there's fluorite for temperance. I mean, that, you know, and that's cool and everything. And I do think that the crystals are well chosen and they go with the themes of those particular major arcana cards. But generally speaking, this is really just a Rider-Waite-Smith deck with unicorns. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that whatsoever. Like I said, I love this deck and I thoroughly enjoy working with it. And it's a pretty candy-colored, fun, and delightful take on the Rider-Waite-Smith. But fundamentally, all it is just a Rider-Waite-Smith. So this is an example of a theme deck where, you know, the theme brings an aesthetic and it brings a fun to the deck, but it doesn't necessarily bring anything new or interesting about our understanding of the tarot in general. Conversely, however, the Game of Thrones deck, I think, I actually will call this deck underrated, because I do think that there are still people out there who I see talking about this deck as though it really is just a novelty deck, like saying that this deck is basically just a Rider-Waite-Smith deck with Game of Thrones characters in place of the other characters from the Rider-Waite-Smith. And that I totally disagree with. I think this deck is really interesting, and it brings a lot of new understanding to the tarot if you actually know enough about Game of Thrones and the storyline and, you know, the very specific backstory of the characters. Fundamentally, what I think is that people who are very casual fans of Game of Thrones, I've noticed, tend to think of this as a novelty deck, whereas people who are totally bonkers crazy fans of Game of Thrones, like I am, tend to think of this as actually a really, really good and interesting deck. So, let's go ahead and take a look at it. And so the reason why I think that this deck is a really, really interesting one is that, again, if you know the specific story of what's going on behind all of the images, it really does bring something interesting to your understanding of the card meaning. Like here, for example, we've got Arya in the Six of Swords. This is when she first arrives in Braavos, and she's going to look for the House of Black and White, and she wants to join the Faceless Men. And part of what she has to do when she does that is she has to let go of her whole identity. She throws all of her stuff like in the water. Like she gets rid of all of her Arya Stark belongings and throws them into the bay. But the thing that she can't bear to give up is her sword needle, because that is such an essential part of her identity. And so, you know, it's interesting because her original journey to Braavos is an escape in a way. But she recognizes that she can't give up her entire past in order to, you know, go off in this new direction, that her past is still part of who she is, and she needs to make her peace with that. And so that, to me, gives an interesting and new interpretation on the Six of Swords. Similarly here with the Seven of Swords, like here we have Samwell basically stealing his father's sword. So like you might look at this and just on a surface level say, yeah, Seven of Swords, guy stealing a sword, sure. But the interesting thing about this one is that, you know, I feel like a lot of times I've sort of very shallow interpretation is assigned to the Seven of Swords of just being like, oh, it's a thief. It's somebody acting with dishonor. It's somebody using trickery. It's somebody trying to get away with something. It's, you know, watch out for a bad person who's going to try to pull one over on you, is basically the interpretation that gets given to the Seven of Swords a lot. And yet Samwell is obviously not a bad person who's trying to put one over on you or on his father. He is actually claiming back here what is his birthright. He is the eldest son, and the sword should belong to him. But because his dad has never respected him or appreciated him, his dad has basically disowned him and is planning to give this sword to his younger brother. So this is Sam really stealing away a weapon that has been used as a weapon against him and making him feel unworthy and making him feel less than. And that, to me, is a really clear meaning of the Seven of Swords that is a really important one to me. When I'm doing a reading and the Seven of Swords comes up, like that is an interpretation that actually applies fairly regularly with that card. And so, so this, to me, again, it gets at a deeper meaning of the Seven of Swords than just what you see on the surface. So, and I could do this with every single card. Like, I mean, I'm like going through and I'm thinking about all of these and going like, yeah, okay, all of these cards, like, say something interesting about that particular card from the perspective of what you know is going on in the story. And so this, to me, is actually a very underrated deck, because despite the fact that it is heavily themed and it's literally published by HBO, like it seems like it should be a novelty, it's actually so smart and so well done. And it's a great reader, because if you know enough about Game of Thrones, like this is a very, very talkative deck, and it suggests a lot of different and interesting things if you know the storyline that is being depicted in each of the cards. Okay, the final category is light work versus shadow work. And the way Marlene talked about this in her original video is she defined this category as more like decks that are aimed at working more with the conscious mind versus decks that are working more with the subconscious mind. I like thinking about the definitions in that way, so I'm going to go with how she defined it in terms of talking about decks that I feel like talk more easily to my conscious mind versus ones that talk more easily to my subconscious mind. But I will say that the deck that I would have chosen, absolutely number one, as a conscious mind deck is the exact same one that Marlene chose, which is the Fountain Tarot. I don't want to talk about it again, obviously, because she already said everything about this deck that I completely agree with, and I think you should go watch her video instead. But yeah, the Fountain Tarot to me is absolutely a conscious mind deck. It's why I use this deck primarily, actually solely, in fact, to read for other people and not to read for myself, because it gives really, really clear, overt messages. It talks very, very, in a very upfront way, I feel like, about a situation. It's just very like sort of neutral and no nonsense, this deck. It just like tells you what you need to know in a very, very clear way. And there's so much like lines and directionality in the deck that it almost sometimes feels like it's just like physically pointing at things for you. You know, like this is just it is a very conscious mind deck. So anyway, that is the one I would have wanted to use in this category. But again, go see what Marlene said about it, because I totally agree with what she said. But in its place, I am going to talk about the Light Seers Tarot. This is another deck that I primarily use to read for other people. I don't really use this deck to read for myself. And it just, honestly, again, it's a deck that I feel like gives its messages in a really clear and upfront way. And to me, it really mostly engages with my conscious mind. I will say that obviously that might not be true for everybody. Other people may have a totally different relationship with this deck than I do. But for me, it just speaks clearly to a specific message. It always is on point with what it needs to say. And it's not a deck that really feels like, in a lot of ways, it delves very deeply into what's going on in my own mind. Like, it feels like it's just like delivering a message, and that's what it's there to do, which makes it an incredibly valuable deck for doing client readings or friends or family readings. So I mean, I really love this deck, but again, like, I don't ever use this to read for myself. So anyway, yeah, that is the Light Seers Tarot. And I will say that I think one of the reasons that I don't use this deck to read for myself is because the Knight of Cups in this deck, I'm honestly not a huge fan of this Knight of Cups. And I'm a big fan of like the other, the whole rest of the deck, but I don't relate to this Knight of Cups in any way. And the Knight of Cups is a super important card to me, and I've talked about this before. So the fact that I can't really like personally relate to the Knight of Cups in the deck sort of makes it like not a deck that I feel super personally connected to, but it is a great reader and it delivers very clear messages. So I really like that about it. So conversely, the Sasuraibito Tarot definitely feels like a deck that speaks more to my subconscious mind. I don't use this deck to read with for other people really at all. I don't know if, I'm trying to think if I ever have. And I don't think so. So this deck, again, somehow, and I think it's partially the way that it kind of goes its own way and some of the images and interpretations, as well as the court cards. This deck feels very internal. All of the courts feel like they're parts of me. They don't feel like external beings or representing people around me. They feel like they're parts of my own inner self. And just the way that the deck is portrayed, like, I don't know, you kind of feel your way through this deck more than logic your way through this deck in certain ways. Or at least, again, that's how it feels to me. It may be different for other people, but this deck to me really gets at and is able to delve into more of what's going on in my own brain. And it's more about like sometimes the visceral reaction that I have to the artwork, and the way that I feel about the character's facial expression, their surroundings, like just, you know, there are just certain aspects of this deck that, like I said, it makes it a deck that I feel my way through rather than necessarily thinking my way through. And so again, I think that makes it it's a good deck for personal work, and that's primarily what I use it for. And like I said, some of the cards are just so visceral, like the Six of Swords. Everybody also always talks about the Eight of Cups in this deck. Super, super visceral. So anyway, so this is another one. There's the Eight of Cups. So this is another one that really feels like it more speaks to my subconscious mind than my conscious mind. And I really love working with it in that way. So anyway, that is the Sasuraibito Tarot. All right, so that is the tag Tarot to the Extreme. This is a really fun one. It was really fun to go through my collection and really think about what decks I might choose for each one of these categories. And it was really interesting how sometimes decks that seemed very similar, you know, had a very different feel and belonged in those extremes, like the two cat black decks, whereas other times there were decks that just like looked so different, you know, that they kind of feel like they belong in two different universes, which is, I think was really the fun of doing this tag, you know, and seeing the ways in which your collection kind of diverges and different decks work well for different purposes. So anyway, thanks so much for hanging out with me while we looked at some extreme decks in my collection, and have a great one, everyone. Bye-bye.